guys, it's Sharon. Happy Thursday. I know it is not the first Thursday of the month, but in case you did not hear, did not notice, which is totally okay, I was on break for the first, I think the last week of December and the first week of January. Either way, after Vlogmas, I took a small break. So that being said, my break fell into the first Thursday of the month, so I wasn't able to post my Zodiac serial killers video, so we are posting it today because better late than never. That being said, I'm not entirely sure if I'm gonna post next month on the first Thursday of the month because I feel like it's very close and back to back, and I don't know. We'll see how that goes, but I'll definitely keep you updated on it. But that being said, if you don't know what this series is once a month, every single month, I talk about a serial killer whose zodiac sign correlates to the month. So for example, right now it's January, so today we're talking about a Capricorn serial killer. So if you want to see more videos like this, give us a thumbs up and let me know in the comments down below. I do have a playlist that you can binge called Zodiac Serial Killers. You can see every episode starting with Aries. So we have, oh my gosh, I think Aquarius and Pisces left. Definitely go check those out if you want to see more. Follow me on Instagram, my Twitter, my TikTok, and let me know. And also subscribe and turn on your post notifications. Now before I get into the video itself, I do want to give you a warning. This is a serial killer video. I do mention rape, I mention pedophilia, and of course I mention murder. So if this triggers you in any way, shape, or form, you do not have to watch this. Our Capricorn serial killer is Dean Corll, also known as the Candyman. Dean Arnold Corll was an American serial killer, rapist, and pederast who abducted, raped, tortured, and murdered at least 28 teenage boys and young men between 1970 and 1973 in Houston and Pasadena, Texas. He was helped by two teenage accomplices, David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley. The crimes became known as the Houston mass murders and at the time were considered the deadliest case of serial murders in America. Dean Arnold Corll was born on December 24th, 1939 in Fort Wayne, Indiana. He was the first child of Mary Emma Robinson and Arnold Edwin Corll. Corll's father was strict with his children and his mother was protective of both of her sons. Their marriage was full of frequent fighting and the couple divorced in 1946, 4 years after the birth of their younger son, Stanley Wayne Corll. Mary sold the family home and relocated to a trailer home in Memphis, Tennessee. This is where Arnold had been drafted into the United States Air Force after the divorce. She moved to allow her children to still be in close contact with their father. Dean was a shy, serious child who rarely socialized with other children, but at the same time displayed concern for the well-being of others. At the age of 7, he suffered an undiagnosed case of rheumatic fever, which wasn't recognized until doctors found that Corll had a heart murmur in 1950. As a result of this diagnosis, Corll was ordered to avoid PE at school. Corll's parents attempted reconciliation and remarried in 1950. They moved to Pasadena, Texas, a suburb of Houston. However, this was short-lived, and in 1953, they divorced again. Mom again regained custody of her two sons. Both boys maintained regular contact with their father. Now, after the second divorce, Corll's mother married a traveling clock salesman named Jake West. The family moved to the small town of Vidor, Texas, or Vidor, Texas, not sure on pronunciation, and this is where Corll's half-sister Joyce Janine was born. Corll's mother and stepfather started a small candy company originally operating from their home garage. From the earliest days of the business, Corll worked day and night while still attending school. He and his younger brother were responsible for running the candy making machines and for packing the product, which his stepfather then sold on his sales route. From 1954 to 1958, Corll attended Vidor High School. He was regarded as a well-behaved student who achieved satisfactory grades. Like in his childhood, Corll was considered a loner, although he is known to have occasionally dated girls in his teenage years. In high school, Corll's only major interest was the brass band in which he played the trombone. Corll graduated high school in the summer of 1958. Shortly after, he and his family moved to the northern outskirts of Houston so that the family candy business could be closer to the city, where a majority of their product was sold. Corll's family opened a new shop which they named Pecan Prince. In 1960, Corll's mother asked him to move to Indiana to live with his widowed grandmother. At the time he moved, Corll had formed a close relationship with a local girl, although he rejected her marriage proposal in 1962. Corll lived in Indiana for almost 2 years but returned to Houston in 1962 to help with the family business, which by this time had moved to Houston Heights. He later moved into an apartment above the shop. Corll's mother divorced West in 1963 and opened a new candy business, which she named Corll Candy Company. Her oldest son, Dean Corll, was appointed vice president, and his younger brother Stanley was appointed secretary treasurer. That same year, one of the teenage boys who was an employee of Corll Candy Company complained to Corll's mother that her son had made sexual advances towards him. She fired the teenager. Corll was drafted into the United States Army on August 10th of 1964. He was assigned to Fort Polk, Louisiana for basic training. He was later assigned to Fort Benning, Georgia, before being assigned to his permanent assignment in Fort Hood, Texas. His period of service in the Army was fine, no issues or anything, though he reportedly hated military service. He applied for a hardship discharge on the grounds that he was needed for his family's business. The Army granted his request, and he was given an honorable discharge on June 11th, 1965 after 10 months of service. Reportedly, some of Corll's close acquaintances said that it was after Corll's release that he had realized he was homosexual. They claimed that Corll told them that he also experienced his first homosexual encounters while serving. Other acquaintances noticed small changes to Corll's mannerisms around teenage boys when he returned back home to Houston. When Corll returned to Houston Heights, he took up his position of vice president for the candy company again. His former stepfather owned their former business, Pecan Prince, so the competition was pretty fierce. Just like in his teenage years, Corll devoted endless hours to the candy business. In 1965, Corll Candy Company relocated to 22nd Street, directly across the street from Helms Elementary School. Corll was known to give free candy to children, especially teenage boys. Because of his free candy, he was nicknamed the Candy Man or the Pied Piper. The company had few employees, and Corll was flirtatious towards majority of the male employees, the younger ones. He even installed a pool table in the back of the candy company where employees and local kids would hang out. In 1967, Corll befriended 12-year-old David Owen Brooks. He was a 6th grade student and one of the kids that got free candy from Corll. Brooks became one of Corll's many young friends, regularly hanging out with Corll and other teenage boys in the rear of the candy factory where the pool table was. He also joined Corll on regular trips he took to the beaches in South Texas along with other teenage boys. Brooks later commented that Corll was the first adult to not mock him for his glasses. Whenever Brooks told Corll that he needed cash, he gave him money, and Brooks began to view Corll as a sort of father figure. Upon Corll's urging, a sexual relationship gradually developed between the two. Beginning in 1969, Corll paid Brooks in cash or gifts to allow him to perform oral sex on the youth. Now, Brooks' parents were divorced. His father lived in Houston and his mother had relocated to Beaumont, a city 85 miles away. In 1970, when Brooks was 15, he dropped out of Waldrop High School and moved to Beaumont to live with his mother. Whenever he visited his father in Houston, he also visited Corll, who allowed him to stay at his apartment if he wanted to. Brooks began considering Corll's apartment his second home. By the time Brooks dropped out of high school, Corll's mother and his half-sister Joyce moved to Colorado after the failed third marriage and the closure of Corll Candy Company in June of 1968. Although she often talked to Corll on the phone, his mother never saw him again. After the closure of the candy company, Corll took a job as an electrician. Between 1970 and 1973, Corll is known to have killed a minimum of 28 victims. All of his victims were males, ages 13 to 20, majority in their mid-teens. Most victims were abducted from Houston Heights, which was then a low-income neighborhood. In most abductions, he was helped by one or both of his two teenage accomplices, David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley. We'll get into Elmer later. Several victims were friends of one or both of these boys, and others were boys who Corll had become acquainted with before abducting and murdering them. Two victims were former employees of Corll's Candy Company. Corll's victims were usually lured into one of two vehicles that Corll owned, either a white van or a 1969 Chevrolet Corvette that he bought for Brooks in early 1971. Victims were lured either on the promise of a party or just a ride home. Instead, victims would be driven to Corll's home, and once there, they would be given alcohol or other drugs until they passed out. They were also tricked into wearing handcuffs or simply grabbed by force. Then they were stripped naked and tied to either Corll's bed or usually a plywood torture board hung on the wall. Then the victims would be sexually assaulted, beaten, tortured, and sometimes after several days, killed by strangulation or shooting with a .22 caliber pistol. Their bodies were then tied in plastic sheets and buried in one of four places: a rented boat shed, a beach on the Bolivar Peninsula, a woodland near Lake Sam Rayburn, where Corll's family owned a lakeside cabin, or a beach in Jefferson County. On several occasions, Corll forced his victims to either phone their parents or write them a letter to explain why they were gone and for them not to panic. During the years that he abducted and murdered victims, he moved around a lot. He always lived in or around Houston Heights before moving to Pasadena in 1973. Corll killed his first known victim on September 25th of 1970. Jeffrey Conan was an 18-year-old college freshman at the University of Texas. He vanished while hitchhiking with another student on the way to his parents' home in Houston. He was dropped off alone at the corner of Westheimer Road and South Voss Road. Corll likely offered Conan a ride home, which Conan accepted. At the time of of Conan's disappearance, Corll lived in an apartment on Yorktown Street, which was near the intersection where Conan was last seen. Conan's body was buried at High Island Beach, and forensics determined he died of asphyxiation caused by manual strangulation and a cloth gag that had been placed in his mouth. About the time of Conan's murder, Brooks caught Corll sexually assaulting 2 boys. They were 2 teenagers that he had strapped to a 4-poster bed. Corll promised Brooks a car in return if he kept his mouth shut. Brooks accepted the offer, and Corll later bought him a green Corvette. Corll later told Brooks that he had killed the 2 boys and offered him $200 for any boy he could lure to Corll's apartment. As of 2021, $200 back then would be around $1,430. On December 13th of 1970, Brooks lured 2 14-year-old boys named Danny Yates and James Glass. Glass was an acquaintance of Brooks who had previously visited Corll's place. Both boys were tied to opposite sides of Corll's torture board, raped, strangled, and buried in a boat shed Corll had rented on November 17th. 6 weeks after the double murder of Glass and Yates, Brooks and Corll encountered 2 teenage brothers, Donald and Jerry Waldrop. They were walking towards their parents' home on January 30th of 1971. The brothers had been driven to their friend's home by their father to talk about starting a bowling league. They found out their friend was at home, so they just decided to walk back to their house. Both boys were enticed into Corll's van and driven back to an apartment that Corll had rented on Magmund Road. There they were raped, tortured, strangled, and buried in the boat shed. Between March and May of 1971, Corll abducted and killed 3 victims. All lived in Houston Heights, and all were buried towards the rear of the boat shed. Brooks participated in all of these abductions. One of the 3 victims, 15-year-old Randall Harvey, was last seen by his family on the afternoon of March 9th, cycling towards his job as a part-time gas station attendant. Harvey was driven to Corll's Magnum Road apartment, where he was killed by a single gunshot to the head. The 2 other victims, 13-year-old David Hilligeist and 16-year-old Gregory Malley-Winkle, were abducted and killed together on the afternoon of May 29th, 1971. Winkle was a former employee of Corll's Candy Company. Both boys' parents were extremely frantic and launched searches for their sons. One of the kids who offered to distribute missing persons posters was 15-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley. He was a lifelong friend of one of the victims, David. On August 17th of 1971, Corll and Brooks encountered one of Brooks' friends, a 17-year-old named Reuben Watson Haney. He was walking home from the movies in Houston. A month before this encounter, Corll had moved to a new apartment on San Felipe Street, so Brooks had convinced Haney to come with them to a party at this address. Haney agreed and called his mom and told him that he was hanging out with Brooks. He was taken to Corll's home, where he was strangled and buried in the boat shed. In September of 1971, Corll moved to another apartment in the Heights. Brooks helped Corll in the abduction of 2 boys during this time, including one boy who was killed just before Elmer Wayne Henley came into the picture. Yes, the boy who was helping in the search party for one of the victims. In his confession, Brooks stated the boy that was killed immediately before Henley's involvement was abducted from the Heights and kept alive for about 4 days before his murder. The identity of both of these 2 victims remains unknown. In the winter of 1971, Brooks introduced Henley to Corll. Henley was lured to Corll's apartment as an intended victim. However, Corll decided he would make a good accomplice and also offered him $200 for any boy he could lure back to his place. He told Henley that he was involved in a white slavery ring based out of Dallas. Henley ignored the offer for several months, though in early 1972 he took it because his family needed the money. Henley said the first abduction he participated in was when Corll lived at 925 Schuler Street, an address he moved to in February of 1972. The 2 picked up a boy and lured him back to Corll's place on the promise of smoking weed. Once there, Henley cuffed his own hands behind his back, freed himself with a hidden key in his back pocket, then tricked the boy into wearing handcuffs before having Corll bind and gag him. Henley left the boy alone with Corll, thinking he was going to be sold into the sex slavery ring. The identity of this victim is believed to be Willard Branch, a 17-year-old who was emasculated, strangled, and buried in the boat shed. He was identified in 1985. A month later, on March 24th of 1972, Henley, Brooks, and Corll encountered 18-year-old Frank Aguirre, who was a friend of Henley's. He was leaving a restaurant on Yale Street where he worked. Henley called him over to Corll's van and invited him to drink beer and smoke weed with all of them back at Corll's place. Aguirre agreed and followed them home. Inside Corll's house, Aguirre smoked weed with them them before picking up a pair of handcuffs that Corll had left on the table. Immediately, Corll pounced on him, pushed him onto the table, and cuffed his hands behind his back. Later on, Henley claimed that he didn't know Corll's true intentions with Aguirre. He tried to persuade Corll not to assault and murder him after he was bound and gagged. Corll refused, telling Henley that he raped, tortured, and killed the previous victim that he had brought him, and that he intended to do the same with Aguirre. Henley assisted Corll and Brooks with burying Aguirre at High Island Beach. Despite finding out Corll was actually killing victims, Henley still participated. A month later, on April 20th, he helped Corll and Brooks abduct 17-year-old Mark Scott. He was a friend of both boys. Scott was grabbed by force and fought Corll, who was trying to restrain him, even attempting to stab him with a knife. However, Scott saw Henley pointing a pistol at him, and Brooks said Scott just gave up. He was tied to the torture board, was raped, tortured, and strangulated, then buried at High Island Beach. Brooks said that Henley was especially sadistic in the murders committed at Schuler Street. Before Corll left this address, Henley assisted Corll and Brooke in the abduction and murder of two boys. Their names were Billy Bolch and Johnny DeLome. In Brooks' confession, he said both boys were tied to Corll's bed, and after their torture and rape, Henley manually strangulated Bolch, then shouted, "Hey Johnny," and shot DeLome in the forehead. DeLome then pleaded with Henley, saying, "Wayne, please don't," before he was strangled. Both boys were buried at High Island Beach. While still living on Schuler Street, the three lured 19-year-old Billy Reidinger to the house. He was tied to the plywood board, tortured, and abused by Corll. Brooks apparently persuaded Corll to let Billy Reidinger go. Another time, Henley knocked Brooks unconscious as he entered the house. Corll then tied Brooks to his bed and assaulted him repeatedly before releasing him. Despite the assault, Brooks continued to help Corll abduct victims. After leaving Schuler Street, Corll moved to an apartment at Westcott Towers. In the summer of 1972, he killed a further two victims. The first was 17-year-old Stephen Sickman, last seen leaving a party in the Heights shortly before midnight on July 19th. He was bludgeoned in the chest with a blunt instrument before he was strangled and buried in the boat shed. About a month later, on or around August 21st, 19-year-old Ray Button was abducted while walking to his job. He was gagged with a towel and his mouth bound with adhesive tape. He was shot twice in the head and buried in the boat shed. Neither victim was named by either Brooks or Henley as being a victim of Corll, and both boys were identified as victims only in 2011. On October 2nd of 1972, Henley and Brooks came across two teenagers. Their names were Wally J. Simino and Richard Hembry, who were walking home. They were enticed into Brooks' Corvette and driven to Corll's apartment at Westcott Towers. That evening, Wally called his mother's home and shouted the word "Mama" into the receiver before the call was disconnected. The next morning, Richard was accidentally shot in the mouth by Henley, with the bullet exiting through his neck. Several hours later, both boys were strangled to death and buried in a common grave in the boat shed. They were placed above the bodies of James Glass and Danny Yates. Sometime the following month, 18-year-old Willard Branch disappeared while hitchhiking from Mount Pleasant to Houston. He knew both Henley and Corll. His gagged and emasculated body was buried in the boat shed. On November 15th, 19-year-old Richard Kepner disappeared on his way to a phone booth. He was strangled and buried at High Island Beach. Altogether, at least 10 teenagers between the ages of 13 and 19 were murdered between February and November of 1972. 5 were buried at High Island Beach and 5 were buried inside the rented boat shed. On January 20th of 1973, Corll moved to an address on Wirt Road. Within 2 weeks of moving, he had killed 17-year-old Joseph Lyles, who knew Corll and Brooks. He had lived on Antoine Drive, which is the same street that Brooks lived on. On March 7th, Corll left this Wirt Road apartment and moved to 2020 Lamar Drive, an address his father had left in Pasadena. No known victims were killed between February 1st and June 4th of 1973. This is probably because Corll suffered from a hydrocele in early 1973. This is swelling of the balls. Also around the time of Lyle's murder, Henley temporarily moved away to try and distance himself from Corll. But in June, Corll's rate of killings increased dramatically and so did the brutality. Henley compared this acceleration to a bloodlust. On June 4th, Henley and Corll abducted 15-year-old William Ray Lawrence. He was last seen alive by his father on 31st Street. After 3 days of abuse and torture, Lawrence was strangled before being buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. Less than 2 weeks later, 20-year-old Raymond Stanley Blackburn Blackburn was abducted, strangled, and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. On July 6 of 1973, Henley began attending classes at the coach's driving school in Bel Air. Here he befriended 15-year-old Homer Lewis Garcia. The following day, Garcia phoned his mother saying he was spending the night with a friend. He was shot and left to bleed to death in Corll's bathtub before being buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. 5 days later, on July 12th, 17-year-old John Sellers was bound, shot to death, and buried at High Island Beach. In July of 1973, after Brooks married his pregnant fiancée, Henley was the only one left to lure victims to Corll's place. He assisted in the abduction and murder of 3 boys between July 19th and 25th. These 3 abductions were the only ones that Brooks was not a part of since the time that Henley began to help out. One of these 3 victims, 15-year-old Michael Bolch, was the brother of a previous victim, Billy Bolch. He was last seen by his family on July 19th on his way to get a haircut. He was strangled and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. The other 2 victims, Charles Cobble and Marty Ray Jones, were abducted together on the afternoon of July 25th. Henley himself buried both of the bodies in the boat shed. On August 3rd, 1973, Corll killed his last victim, a 13-year-old boy named James Staten Drimala. He was abducted by Brooks and Corll while riding his bike in Pasadena. He was taken back to Corll's with the promise of collecting empty glass bottles to resell. At Corll's home, James was tied to Corll's torture board, raped, tortured, and strangled with a cord before being buried in the boat shed. On the evening of August 7th of 1973, Henley was 17 at the time and invited a 19-year-old named Timothy Cordell Curley to attend a party at Corll's residence in Pasadena. Brooks was not present at the time. The 2 boys arrived at Corll's place, where they sniffed paint fumes and drank alcohol until midnight before leaving the house. They promised to return in a bit. Henley and Curley then drove back to Houston Heights, and Curley parked his car close to Henley's home. They got out, and Henley heard a commotion coming from across the street. It was coming from the house of his 15-year-old friend, Rhonda Louise Williams. He walked toward her home and found her beaten by her drunken father that evening, as she was nursing a sprained ankle. She accepted Henley's invitation to join him and Curley at Corll's place. Around 3 a.m. on the morning of August 8th, 1973, Henley, Curley, and Williams returned to Corll's place. Corll was pissed that Henley had brought a girl. He told him in private that he had ruined everything. Henley told him what happened with her dad, and Corll appeared to calm down. He offered the 3 beers and weed. They began drinking and smoking, with Henley and Curley sniffing paint fumes and Corll's watching them intently. After about 2 hours, William, Henley, and Curley passed out. Henley woke up to find himself lying on his stomach and Corll snapping handcuffs on his wrist. His mouth had been taped shut and his ankles had been bound together. Curley and Williams lay beside him, securely bound with nylon rope, gagged with tape, and lying face down on the ground. Curley had been stripped naked. After noticing that Henley woke up, Corll removed the gag from his mouth. Corll reiterated that he was angry that Henley had brought a girl to his house and that he was going to kill all 3 of them after he assaulted and tortured Curley. He said, "Man, you blew it bringing that girl," before shouting, "I'm gonna kill you all, but first I'm gonna have my fun." He then repeatedly kicked Williams in the chest, lifted Henley to his feet, dragged him to the kitchen, and placed a .22 caliber pistol against his stomach, threatening to shoot him. Henley calmed Corll, promising to participate in the torture and murder of Curley and Williams if Corll released him. After about 30 minutes of discussion, Corll agreed and untied Henley, then carried Curley and Williams into his bedroom and tied them to opposite sides of the torture board. Curley on his stomach, Williams on her back. Corll then handed Henley a hunting knife and ordered him to cut away Williams' clothes, insisting that while he raped and killed Curley, Henley would do the same to Williams. Henley began cutting away Williams' clothes as Corll undressed and began to assault and torture Curley. Curley began writhing and shouting as Williams, whose gag Henley had removed, asked Henley, "Is this for real?" Henley answered yes. Then Williams asked, "Are you going to do anything about it?" Henley then asked Corll if he could take Williams into another room. Corll ignored him. Then Henley grabbed Corll's pistol, shouting, "You've gone far enough, Dean." As Corll got off of Curley, Henley continued shouting, "I can't go on any longer. I can't have you kill all my friends." Corll approached him saying, "Kill me, Wayne." Henley stepped back a few steps, and Corll continued to approach him, shouting, "You won't do it." Henley then fired at Corll, hitting him in the forehead. The bullet failed to fully penetrate Corll's skull, so he continued to creep towards Henley. So he fired another 2 rounds, hitting Corll in the left shoulder. Corll then ran out of the room, hitting the wall in the hallway. Henley fired 3 additional bullets into his lower back and shoulder as Corll slid down the wall in the hallway outside the room where the 2 teenagers were bound. Corll died where he fell, his naked body lying facing the wall. After he shot Corll, Henley released Curley and Williams from the torture board on the wall. All 3 teenagers dressed and discussed what they should should do. Henley suggested that they should just leave, to which Curly said, no, we should call the police. Henley agreed and looked up the phone number to the Pasadena Police Department in Corll's telephone directory. His call was answered by an operator named Velma Lyons. Henley blurted to the operator, y'all better come here right now. I just killed a man. Henley gave the address to the operator as 2020 Lamar Drive. As the three waited on Corll's porch for the police to arrive, Henley mentioned to Curly that he had done that 4 or 5 times. He was referring to killing by shooting. Minutes later, a patrol car arrived. Henley told the officer that he was the individual who made the call and indicated that Corll's body was inside the house. The officer confiscated the pistol and placed Henley, Williams, and Curly inside the patrol car. He entered the house, found Corll's body, then returned to a car and arrested Henley. He shouted, I don't care who knows about it. I have to get it off my chest. Curly later told detectives that before police had arrived, Henley told him, if he wasn't my friend, I could have gotten $200 for you. In custody, Henley was initially questioned for the murder of Corll. He said it was in self-defense, and when questioned about his claim that Corll had threatened him that morning, he had shouted that he had killed several boys, and Henley explained that for almost 3 years, he and Brooks helped procure teenage boys for Corll, who raped and murdered them. Henley admitted that he helped Corll in several abductions and murders, and that he had actively participated in the torture and mutilation of 6 or 8 victims. This was prior to their murder. He then said where they were buried and how much Corll paid him. Police were skeptical and thought it was just a drug trip gone wrong that led to the murder of Corll. It wasn't until Henley mentioned 3 missing boys' names that they started to believe it. He mentioned Cobble, Hilligeast, and Jones. All 3 were listed as missing by the Houston Police Department. Hilligeast had been reported missing in the summer of 1971. The other 2 boys had been missing for just 2 weeks. The police found suspicious and incriminating items in Corll's van, home, and backyard, including a wooden crate with air holes drilled into the side. This was in Corll's backyard, and inside the crate were several strands of human hair. On August 8th, Henley agreed to accompany police to Corll's boat shed. This is where he claimed the bodies of most of the victims could be found. Inside the boat shed, police found a stolen half-stripped car, a child's bike, a large iron drum, water container, 2 sacks of lime, and a large plastic bag full of teenage boys' clothes. They also found 8 bodies by 11:55 p.m. Brooks presented himself at Houston Police Department headquarters with his dad. This happened on the evening of August 8th, and he gave a statement in which he denied any participation in the murders, but admitted to having known that Corll raped and killed 2 boys in 1970. The next morning on August 9th, Henley gave a full written statement detailing his and Brooks' involvement with Corll. In this confession, Henley admitted to have personally killed about 9 victims. He also admitted to having assisted Corll to the strangulation of others. He stated that the only 3 abductions that Brooks had not helped them out in was in the summer of 1973. That afternoon, Henley accompanied police to Lake Sam Rayburn, where he, Brooks, and Corll had buried 4 victims they killed that year. 2 additional bodies were found, and inside the lakeside log cabin owned by Corll, police found a second plywood torture board, rolls of plastic sheeting, shovels, and a sack of lime. Police found 9 additional bodies in the boat shed on August 9th. Brooks gave a full confession on the evening of August 9th, admitting to being present at several of the killings and assisting in the burials, although he continued to deny any direct participation in the murders. He agreed to accompany police to High Island Beach to help search for more bodies. On August 10th of 1973, Henley again accompanied police to Lake Sam Rayburn, where 2 more bodies were found. That afternoon, both Henley and Brooks went with police to High Island Beach. They led police to the shallow graves of 2 victims. On August 13th, both Henley and Brooks once again went with police to High Island Beach. This is where 4 more bodies were found, making it a total of 27 known victims, the worst killing spree in American history at the time. Henley insisted that there were 2 more bodies to be found in the boat shed, and 2 more bodies had been buried at High Island Beach in the summer of 1972. At the time, the killing spree was the worst case of serial murder in terms of the number of victims. This was surpassed in 1978 by John Wayne Gacy, who murdered 33 boys and young men, and admitted to being influenced by the press coverage of the Houston mass murders and Dean Corll. Now, families of Corll's victims were highly critical of the Houston Police Department. They had been quick to list the boys that were missing as runaways, who had not been considered worthy of any major investigation. Once again, Houston Heights was a low-income neighborhood. Now, Everett Waldrop, who was the father of the brothers Donald and Jerry Waldrop, complained that shortly after his sons disappeared in 1971, he told the police an acquaintance saw Corll burying what appeared to be bodies at his boat shed. The police performed an effortless search around the boat shed before dismissing the reports as a hoax. Elmer Wayne Henley and David Owen Brooks were tried separately for their role in the murders. I noticed my camera shifted. My battery died and I had to switch it out and now it's bugging me. Anyways, Henley was brought to trial in San Antonio in July 1st of 1974 and was charged of 6 murders committed between March of 1972 and July of 1973. On July 15th, the jury found him guilty of all 6 murders for which he was tried. On August 8th, Henley was ordered to serve each 99-year sentence consecutively, totaling 594 years. Henley appealed and he was given a retrial, which began on June 19th of 1979. Henley's attorneys once again tried to have his written statement ruled inadmissible, but it failed and he still had to serve his 594-year sentence. Now, Brooks was brought to trial on February 27th of 1975. He had been indicted for 4 murders committed between December 1970 and June 1973, but was brought to trial only with the June 1973 murder of 15-year-old William Ray Lawrence. Brooks' defense attorney argued that he had not committed any of the murders and that Corll and Henley were the only ones active in the murders. Brooks was still found guilty on March 4th of 1975 and sentenced to life imprisonment. He tried to appeal, but it was dismissed. Henley is 65 as of January 2022 and is serving his life sentence in Anderson County, Texas. Parole applications dating from July 1980 have been denied. He is next eligible for parole in October of 2025. Brooks served his life sentence at the Terrell Unit near Sharon, Texas. He died of COVID-19 related complications on May 28th of 2020. He was 65. 42 boys had vanished in the Houston area between 1970 and the time of Corll's death in 1973. The police were heavily criticized after stopping the search after finding the 26th and 27th bodies, even after Henley claimed that 2 more bodies were buried at that beach. 2 extra bones, an arm bone, and a pelvis were discovered with the last bodies, indicating at least 1 additional undiscovered victim. The 2 bodies that Henley insisted were still on the beach may have been the bodies of Scott and Lyles. Had the search continued, they probably would have been found. Lyles' remains were found by chance in 1983. After Hurricane Ike in 2008, the area of High Island Beach where Corll is known to have buried his victims became submerged and remains this way. This leaves a strong possibility that Scott's body may never be found. Due to the details given by Brooks and Henley and the extra bones found, there are a minimum of 2 and possibly 4 more unknown victims. In February 2012, a colored Polaroid photo was released to the media of a possibly unknown victim of Corll. The image was found in the personal belongings of Henley, which had been stored by his family since his arrest in 1973. The boy shown had been ruled out by the Harris County Medical Examiner as being one of the known victims of Corll, including his 1 remaining known unidentified victim. Henley stated that the photo must have been taken after he got a Polaroid camera in 1972, although he had no idea who this boy was. It's likely the boy would have been killed in 1972 or 1973. In November of 2021, there was a search for more victims buried at Corll's home in Pasadena. No bodies were found, though it's expected that there's up to 20 victims still out there. Henley has been willing to help, saying he truly believes that Dean had another storage shed at the boat storage where they dug up 17 bodies. Searchers said they will continue to communicate with Henley and keep searching, all in hopes of helping the families who believe their loved ones may have been some of Corll's victims. And that is all I have for you today on Dean Corll, the real-life Candyman. I know it's a lot what I just gave you, and it is just very sad how I can't get over this. This is just another case of had the police just listened to people, so many of this could have been prevented. And I think that's what sucks the most. Just the fact that a parent was literally like, someone said they saw Corll burying what looked like bodies at the boat shed, where they later found 17 bodies. I want to know what you guys think about this real life Candyman. Any thoughts, any feelings, any ideas, opinions, whatever you are feeling and thinking, make sure to comment that down below and let me know. This is my 3rd to last episode in this series, which is crazy to think that a year has already almost flown by. We still have an Aquarius serial killer left and a Pisces serial killer left. Spoiler alert, I did mention the Pisces serial killer in this video, so if you know, you know, and I still have to choose an Aquarius serial killer. So if you have any ideas or requests for an Aquarius serial killer, let me know. Also anyone that you want me to talk about in general as well. Shout out of the day goes to Eliza on Instagram. Thank you so much. If you'd like to be shout out of the day, just follow me on my Instagram and stay active. And like I mentioned, this is a series that I upload once a month, every single month. So I do have a playlist on my channel titled Zodiac Serial Killers where you can watch every single episode starting with Aries. If you'd like to see more videos kind of like this, I would recommend checking out my Halloween content. I do a lot of true crime, mystery, murder, spooky type of videos during that time. So lots of bingeable content. If you'd like to see more, definitely make sure you subscribe and your post notifications are turned on. All that being said, I'll see you guys next time. Bye.